Greetings from First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. We have now resumed in-person worship with one service at 10 a.m., which is live streamed both on Facebook and on YouTube. We alternate each week between contemporary and traditional music. You may confirm worship times and receive more information by visiting our website, firstinyourheart.org. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
Our first scripture reading comes from the 4th chapter of Mark. Jesus has gathered with the disciples and a large crowd and begins to teach them through a long series of parables, including why he teaches in parables. And he progresses through the day. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in a boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great gale arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Our second reading comes from the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel and tells the familiar story of David and Goliath. Sit back, because it's a long one. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and there came out from camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armored with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. In preparation for the Olympic Games in Atlanta in 1996, Nike put up a billboard that said, "You don't win silver, you lose gold." According to Nike, it was supposed to be inspiring. But for U.S. wrestler Townsend Saunders, who is an Arizona State alum, when he walked out of the arena wearing a silver medal, he said those words stung. "It's not terrible for everyone else to read," he said. "It's just terrible for every silver medalist." He went home depressed, thinking that he should have given more efforts and won the gold medal. It was an honor to represent my country, he said, but to have come so close. Eventually, he came to terms with his loss, and he realized that not many people had silver medals either. And really, the billboard seemed to be in opposition to much of what the Olympics is actually about. Baron de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympic Games, said, "The important thing in the Olympics is not winning, but taking part. The essential thing in life is not conquering, but fighting well." And I think that's one of the things, at least for me, that makes the Olympics great. Is that we're certainly people that we win, that we recognize and celebrate, people like Jesse Owens or Simone Biles or Michael Phelps. But often we're just as amazed and we're just as celebratory of athletes we see giving everything they have, even if they don't have a shot at winning. The Olympics are just as much, or maybe even more, about those athletes. And so perhaps with that idea, it's appropriate that today's film that we move on to is Cool Runnings, about the Jamaica bobsled team. And yes, Jamaica had a bobsled team, first appeared in 1988 at the Calgary Games. In trying to find films for this series, I wanted to find a film that talked about an athlete who was supposed to have won but didn't. But they're not easy to come by. There's a couple out there. And so the next best option was films that celebrate the mere act of competing. And of those films, I think this is one of the best. But we do have to be honest. It says that this is based upon a true story. And yes, it's based upon it. That is, Jamaica did have a bobsled team in the '88 Olympics. And there's a couple other things in the film that are actually true. But for the most part, it's fiction. It doesn't tell the story of what actually happened. And so perhaps this marks this movie as different from the other Olympic films we've already looked at and we'll look at next week. And it's still very entertaining, but don't take this as the true story of the Jamaica bobsled team. And in that maybe has some bigger connection to the story of David and Goliath as well. But in trying to set up the story, the creation of the bobsled team starts with dreams of Olympic glory ending in failure. So take a look. Dreams are over. And 4 years is a lifetime for many athletes, especially in track and field. And maybe their lives would have been filled with the questions of what might have been. But after they lose out in running for the Olympics, Derice Bannock sees a picture of his father, who we're told was a gold medalist in sprinting for Jamaica, standing next to a gold medal winner for bobsled. And he had come down to Jamaica to try and recruit sprinters to try out for bobsled, knowing that the start is the most important part, and you could overcome lots of things if you could get a great start in bobsledding. And so Bannock goes to see Irv Blitzer, played by the great John Candy in one of his last films. And he gets the coach to agree to coach a bobsled team from Jamaica as long as Derice will put together a team, which he does, made up primarily of the other two runners there that also lose out. Now, this is part of the story that's made up. Actually, they recruited the bobsled team out of the military. Then they were not elite sprinters beforehand. But their goal is not just to put a sled onto the track, but they actually want to compete against the world's best, while also recognizing that the best teams in bobsledding are the best for reasons. One being that they have a tradition of bobsledding, and second, they have snow and ice in the countries they come from. Now, in reality, the Jamaican bobsled team did go to Lake Placid, New York, in order to train. They competed in several competitions in Europe before the Olympic Games, but they really only had a few months on a real bobsled track before going to the Olympic Games for the first time. And that year, the Swiss were considered the best team, along with the other usual candidates, the Germans, East and West, and the Soviet Union, the Goliaths, as it were, amongst the bobsledding world. But Derice, who is the driver, becomes enamored with the Swiss team. He studies their every move, everything that they're doing to prepare, and he wants to be just like them, to get his team to be just like them as well. And so in their first official run after qualifying for the Olympic Games, he wants them to do just like the Swiss do, and it turns out a little less than desirable. So take a look. And so in the bobsledding scenes, they're interspersing with actual scenes from the '88 Games. But when Goliath appears on the battlefield, the Israelites are terrified, because by all accounts, the man is huge. Although there are differences in the manuscript traditions, he is said to stand anywhere between 6'9" and 9'9". Even at 6'9", he would have been massive for the time. And it's possible the higher height is given as an exaggeration in order to prove a point, like saying, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. The tallest man on record, a verified tallest man, was Robert Wadlow, who stood 8'11" at his death at the age of 22 and was still growing at the time. He also happened to have immense strength that came from the disease that caused him to grow. And as Wadlow's disease, Malcolm Gladwell points out in his book, David and Goliath, also causes eyesight problems, which should sort of match, if that's what's going on with Goliath, match some of the other things that seem sort of strange in Goliath's interactions with David. So Goliath is huge and he's exceedingly strong. His armor weighs 125 pounds. The spearhead weighs 15 pounds by itself. And so perhaps the Israelites are right to be afraid. And what Goliath is calling for is an individual battle. He's standing out in front of the Philistine army and saying, I'm the best soldier we have. Send me your best soldier and we'll duke it out together. And no one is willing to do that because they don't think there's any chance that they can win. They see Goliath's size and they see his armor and he sees just too powerful to overcome. But then along comes young David. And now this is where we might say this passage is based upon a true story because there's several problems in the story, many of which cannot be reconciled. The first is that in chapter 16, David is serving in Saul's court and he becomes so beloved by Saul that he actually becomes Saul's armor bearer. But then in chapter 17, David has to be introduced to Saul as if they have never met before. That's part of the passage we didn't hear. This juxtaposition that these two chapters just don't match each other. Now, it's possible this is just another part of the story of David's tradition that the author or the editor of the book put in there, not concerned about continuity, which is sometimes the case. But we can't reconcile these two stories together. The bigger problem is that in 2 Samuel, we are told that Elhanan of Bethlehem, which is also where David is from, that he is the one who kills Goliath. And because Goliath is only actually named twice in the 17th chapter in the story with David, usually he's just referred to as the Philistine, it's possible that the story of the killing of Goliath got applied to David later in the tradition, not only to prove David's military might, but also to show his wisdom and his fearlessness and his boldness in action. He's willing to do things that other people are not willing to do. Now, the author of 1 Chronicles, which also tells stories of David, tries to reconcile all of these by saying that Elhanan didn't kill Goliath, but instead killed Lahmi, who was Goliath's cousin. So whatever the historicity of the story, Goliath is a giant who threatens the Israelites, and no one is able or willing to do anything until David stands up, and he comes on the scene and says that he will take on the challenge. And I might also add in this section, the passage we didn't hear, he's told that whoever goes out and if they're victorious against Goliath, that Saul will give them big rewards, including giving him the hand of his daughter in marriage. And so David says, I am that man, or at least I want to be. And what does Saul do? He steps forward and he puts on his helmet on David's head and he puts his armor onto David and he puts his sword onto David, and David tries to walk in it, but he's unable to. And he says, I cannot walk in these, for I'm unused to them. And so David takes the armor off, and he begins to prepare for battle in his own way. So the same things happened with the Jamaicans after their disastrous first run. They get chastised by their coach, and then they have a team meeting. He is to be the best Jamaicans they can be. They can't beat the Swiss by trying to be pale imitations of who the Swiss are. They have to be who they are. And the same is true for David. He cannot beat Goliath by matching Goliath by the way Goliath wants to fight. Goliath's sheer strength will be enough to give him the edge over David in hand-to-hand combat. Goliath will beat him if David tries to fight him the way Goliath wants to fight. But what David does have is skill and agility and speed and the ability to use a slingshot. And so rather than rejecting his own skills of who he is, David decides to embrace them and to not meet Goliath on Goliath's terms, to meet Goliath the way David wants to meet Goliath. And we should note that Goliath is disdainful of David because he won't encounter him the way that you're supposed to do. And so David has changed up the rules because the way Goliath plays simply won't work for him. He will lose. And it turns out that what Goliath thinks is his greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. But he doesn't realize that until it's too late, when he can't move to evade what David is about to do. So Goliath and Saul and the Israelites and the Philistines all saw power in brute strength and size. And they couldn't imagine anything else being powerful. Just like thinking the Jamaicans might be good bobsledders because sprinters could get off the line quicker than anybody else. Other people weren't thinking that way. Or in the movie Indiana Jones, you might remember the scene where Indy is facing a guy with two swords and he's swinging them all around. And clearly Indy's not going to beat him in sword play, so what's he do? He pulls out his gun and he shoots him, right? He can't match him sword for sword, so he does what he can do best. And he doesn't even try to do what the other man is doing. As they say, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Don't try and overcome someone else's power and skill if you don't have that same power and skill. Use what you have to be the best that you can be. And so you can't beat hate with hate. You can't beat violence with violence. You can't beat the brute squad by putting together a bigger and better brute squad. Instead, come up with your own way of competing. Not cheating, not bending or ignoring the rules, but doing things the way you have to do them to be the best that you can be, to use the gifts and graces you have been given, to do the things that God has called you to do, because God won't call you to do something you don't have the skills for. I've said this before, when Jesus calls the first disciples, he does not say to them, "Come follow me and I will make you shopkeepers of men," or "Come follow me and I will make you carpenters of men." Instead, he says, "Come follow me and I will make you fish for people." Why? Because they're fishermen. He's using the gifts and graces they already have to do the work of God. David can't beat Goliath by becoming Goliath or trying to be Goliath. And the Jamaicans cannot beat the Swiss by trying to be the Swiss. They can only be themselves. And so what will be their final run in the movie, they have a chance to win a medal if they're good enough. That wasn't true again in reality, but it makes a much better story. And one other piece added, which was also not true, was they say that the coach, after winning 2 gold medals, had been caught for cheating, and the gold medals were stripped from him. And when he's asked why he cheated, he says, "If you aren't enough without medals, you'll never be enough with them. Because winning then becomes everything in order to prove your own worth to yourself." It's about what is inside of us to start that makes us worthy for ourselves and others. And so Jerice then asks him how he will know if he is good enough. And he's told, "When you finish, you'll know." And so here is their final run, again interspersed with actual footage from the '88 Olympics. So I can remember watching that live because I love bobsledding, which is sort of strange for a guy from Phoenix, although I think it was the cold that was attractive to me. And honestly, I can remember thinking there's no way the driver survives after having his head slammed into the wall at 85 miles an hour and then being dragged down the rest of the track 2,000 feet. The brakeman actually said his helmet began to burn because of the friction with the ice, and he could still smell his helmet burning years later. And the most disappointing thing I learned in looking at the differences between the reality and the film was that they didn't actually say, "Feel the rhythm, feel the rhyme, get on up, it's bobsled time." But I'm going to pretend that they did because that sounds much better and sounds like something they would have said. And it marked them as doing things in their own way. And they did cross the finish line after the crash, although they did not carry the sled because it weighs nearly 500 pounds. They pushed it across the finish line. But what they show us, what David shows us, is that we have to be who we are. We can have dreams of who we want to be, of being better, but we have to be who we are. We can't be who others tell us we should be. The power of the world rarely comes the way the world says it should be. And that those who want to project power and authority and strength to let you know that they have it, usually they don't. They're trying to overcome their own insecurities. And usually if you try and match that, they won't stand up. As Malcolm Gladwell says, David reveals the folly of our assumptions about power. And the Jamaican bobsled team reveals the folly of our assumptions about winning. Because you might now know that the Swiss won the gold medal in four-man bobsled in 1988, but I'm guessing that nobody here knows who won silver or gold, but I know that many of you remember the Jamaican bobsled team, and none of those other three teams have a movie made about them. Even though we praise winners and think it's all about winning, it's also about doing our best. It's about finishing the race before us. And sometimes, simply by doing that, we get a greater reward than we would ever get if we simply just won. Especially when it's about using our gifts and graces that God has given to us and trusting that God will see us through. And ultimately, it's about knowing that winning doesn't make us who we are. And if we have to keep winning to prove our worth, we will never be enough. We can never win enough. Instead, it's about knowing that our identity comes because we are children of God. That's where we get our worth from. And we are baptized children at that. And as Martin Luther said when he woke up every morning, I am a baptized child of God, and that's enough. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters. Amen.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to follow our YouTube channel and Twitter, and like us on Facebook if you haven't already. And remember that every action you take today could change someone's life. So make sure it's a good one and be an agent of love. God bless.